Hi everyone. Well, I hope you took the opportunity to have a look at the little bit of film footage that we linked you to through YouTube from the film 21 Up, part of the 7 Up series, which has documented the lives of people in Britain from the age of 7 onwards, and has just recently produced the 56 Up film. So it's certainly been a very longitudinal study and some fascinating stuff. I show that to you for a couple of reasons. One is I think it is very interesting and helps set the scene for the kind of issues we want to talk about this week. I also show it because that's the film that brought me into sociology. I think if anything stirred my sociological imagination, it was the 7 Up series. Absolutely fascinating stuff, stimulated my thinking in all sorts of ways. But let me not get too lost in that. There's quite a bit of work to get through this week. Quite a bit of information that I want to throw your way, and there'll be a slightly extended introduction for that reason. Let's get on with it. This week, I want you first of all to start looking at some data coming out of the Australian Bureau of Statistics about education and training, national trends in that regard. I want you all to have a look at that, to have a think about it no matter where you're coming from. And those of you coming into the tutorials next week, the UWA students, that's what I'm asking you to do the summary work on, and to bring some ideas about that, to bring something written to the tutorial next week. Then I ask you to go through a bit of a reflective exercise again. Why go to university? Thinking about it from your own point of view, but also then thinking about it sociologically, really starting to get the sociological imagination into play in all of this. There's a reading from Tranter, who at the time of writing this paper was doing a research in Adelaide, the University of Adelaide, and amongst disadvantaged secondary school students in that city, and was asking them interesting questions about university, what it meant to them, what it meant to go there, how difficult or easy that might be. I want to give you then some a couple of lectures in this particular week. It's my area of specialty, so there's different things I want to get at. I want to get at some of the key ideas first of all, and then I just want to talk a little bit about areas that have been of interest to me over the past decade or so, thinking about school choice, educational choice, and more recently notions of mobile modernity, sociology of choice, which I think you'll see taps into the very issues that we've been talking about in, I hope, some interesting ways. The forum and tutorial questions for this week will focus on what enables or prevents young people from attending university, getting that sociological imagination going on this. For example, one question that arises, is it achievement or ascription? I'll explain more about that in this particular introduction and later. We are wanting to focus a little bit on work as well, so there's a little bit more to do in terms of looking at another Australian Bureau of Statistics report, 50 years of labour force, just looking at some of the changes in work trends. So for those of us focused on Australian society, it allows us to I think draw some interesting conclusions out of that. Those of you who are focused in other parts of the world, thinking about other parts of the world, you should use this as a comparative study. To what extent does this speak to your experience or the experience of those people around you? There'll be the usual consolidation exercises following that. From this week's readings then and lecture, make sure that you understand the difference between reproductionist approaches to education and modernisation approaches, which can be summarised in terms of conflict and structural functionalist approaches. Understand the idea of habitus and its applications. Cultural capital, I think, should get thrown into that as well. Grasp the implications of ascription and achievement to educational debates and beyond. It isn't just applicable to education, although it does throw up some interesting ways of looking at it and useful ways of looking at these sorts of ideas, which can get summarised in terms of, is it about personal achievement, or is this about some sort of, is this something, do we get to where we get to because of the family background that we come from, the ethnic background we come from, and so on. I'm also aiming to further develop your understanding of practice structuration theory, very much a part of this week's work. So I want to deal with schooling and to give some structural history to that, because I think there's some important questions arise there. Emmy Stambach, writing about African schools, talks about schools as windows into complexities, contradictions of cultural change. I, in some earlier writing, wrote about schools as a lens for comprehending the wider society in which they're located and replicated. And what we're really getting at here when we start to think of social theory and schooling, schools are sites of social production, and that is very much the take of a modernisation theorist, structural functionalist. Conflict theorists look at it a little bit differently and add the re to it. They're actually sites of reproduction, that they reinforce differences in society more than they allow people to transcend those differences. Is part of really what the argument is there. A way perhaps between those two, which we've been talking about, practice or structuration theory, which then hyphenates the idea so that it is reproduction, so it is simultaneously production and reproduction of what's there. Let's get into that and let's explore those ideas further. Work is the other focus in all of this, so education leading to some form of work, which may be meaningful, may not be meaningful. Those of us living in largely industrialised societies, as Winefield points out, makes the point that the gainful employment, highly valued, and has a dramatic impact on individual identity. Of course, if it's not gainful, it can have a dramatic impact as well, but in much more negative terms. Largely determines residential location and often education. I'd say that there's a circle at play there. The degree to which education determines gainful employment is another element of that, which is missing in this particular quote. Does take up a large part of people's lives, no question about that. You think about the number of hours that many of us are working, or at least hoping to work in our lifetime. Interesting questions arise, really, don't they? The other side of this, of course, is that to not have work and what that means. And that could be about seeing oneself as a failure, having an indeterminate identity and status, and to be perceived as somehow being carried by the work of others, to be freeloading, bludging, as the common phrase might be in Australia, to be dependent, to have an uncertain future. So if schooling, education is a means to work, then what does that mean? We are going to focus much more on education than we are on work in this module, but it's certainly there, and we have to, I think it's worth holding the two in the dynamic tension that I think that they offer us. Van Kruijken et al., a significant book, Introduction to Sociology in Australia, make the point that without an understanding of education we cannot understand society. Absolutely, I say. And I find it interesting that anthropologists in particular, but sociologists also, are paying less and less attention to formal education. And I would like to put to anybody there, I think that schools, universities might just be significant social institutions. Just got that funny feeling. It's important to understand education from a historical perspective, and I think it's also significant to acknowledge that educational sociology's preoccupation in the last 30, 40 years has been on these questions of inequality and school and universities' role in reproducing and changing these inequalities. There's been a lot of talk in Australia recently about a certain report called the Gonski Report. And the Gonski Report was commissioned to have a look at school funding models by the current Australian federal government. And they were asked to make recommendations about how to make the school system more efficient and more equitable. And these are some of the this is some of the base data that they're working from. So we see here on this particular chart a graphing of different socioeconomic groupings based on income, family income, household income, the bottom quartile, second quartile, third quartile, top quartile. So the top 25%, the bottom 25%, and the two groups in between that. So just taking it on a straight out array of numbers and drawing lines at the 25% marks for each of those. Okay, so all things being equal, each of the different school systems mentioned here, government, Catholic and independent, should have 25% of each grouping in there. But of course they don't. Government schools have a much higher proportion of students coming from families occupying the bottom quartile of Australian society in terms of household income. Independent schools, on the other hand, now these are the schools that aren't Catholic, these are the fee-paying schools that aren't Catholic, aren't government schools, so they're mainly Protestant denomination schools, but they also are Islamic schools. There's also Montessori schools, Steiner schools, and schools that have grown up out of a community. Some community grouping has formed these, and this includes a small but not insignificant number of Indigenous schools that are independent of the government system, are coming out of the community and are run by the community. Okay, so what we see here is that the independent schools are dominated. Nearly half of the students enrolled in the independent school sector are coming from the top quartile, so the top 25% of income earners. And you can see what's going on in the rest of those charts, but I think they're the significant two numbers that the Gonski group were looking at. All right, now let's have a look at this. We go straight away to the right-hand column here. The government sector, this is actually about all student enrolments, the share in each sector. So you've got the government sector, 2/3 of students are enrolled in the government sector, 20% in the Catholic sector, 14% in the independent sector. So then we go across some of these measures then of disadvantage that Gonski focused on. So a language background other than English featured here, and as you can see, it's pretty close to the representation in the different schools. So we're not seeing an overrepresentation of languages other than English groups here in the government school sector. However, the question I would want to ask of that data is, which language groups are we talking about? And the chances are, I think, that the more disadvantaged of the language bases other than English are going to be in this sector here. And you can start to see this in then some of the other data coming out through here. So the bottom SEA, socioeconomic quartile, is located, you've got 79%, so an overrepresentation of this grouping in the government school sector and a significant underrepresentation in the independent school sector. No surprise given the data that was shown before. Remote, very remote areas, and this is where the greatest level of disadvantage is actually noticed. This is, if you live in a remote area of Australia, you are least likely of all of these different groups to get to further education beyond high school. So excuse me, strong overrepresentation here. So government schools are doing most of the work in the remote and very remote areas of Australia. Very few independent schools. Catholic schools are located there, but obviously less than their general proportion in the population. Students with disability, 78%, 16.6, and then Indigenous. The vast majority of Australia's Indigenous students are attending government schools. And the other groups are both significantly underrepresented compared with their normal proportions. In fact, you could argue that Catholic schools in particular are very strongly underrepresented in this domain. Comprehending our times, the significance of this. I want to put to you that the significance of post-secondary education and training in second modernity, the very ideas that are put to us by Cuervo and Wynne in their book on young people making it work, we were dealing with in the last module. And I want to explore some of those issues, and I want you to keep those issues in mind as you go through. And there's a link here to an interview that Australian Prime Minister Julia Gillard had with Fran Kelly from Radio National on the breakfast program, talking about the Gonski reforms. And what she was really doing there was making the case for state governments to fall into line and to adopt the recommendations, the funding recommendations that the government is offering on this. Now, it's about a half-hour interview, I think, so it's worth you having a look if you want to explore some of these issues further. But let me just pull out a couple of the key quotes from this. One of the very first points that the Prime Minister makes is that budgets are about choices, and you show what you value through the choices you make. Very true. The ways in which we look after schools or don't look after them, the ways in which we value them, the ways in which we fund them, tell us an awful lot about the values underlying and underpinning the society in which we're located. I think that's a truism. Later on in the interview, in again making the case that she's trying to make that people need to adopt the funding model of the Gonski Review, she asks the question rhetorically, is it acceptable to you that you live in a country where some kids go to schools that are less resourced than other children? And that you live in a country where inherent in our school funding system we're saying that some kids should get a second class go and a worse education. Now, second class go, for those of you not familiar with the Australian idiom, is a reference to the notion of a fair go. And this is an extraordinary statement from an Australian Prime Minister to make, that there are people in Australia getting a second class go. Most Prime Ministers will extol the virtues of Australian society in terms of this is the land of the fair go. This is what we value most of all. We are the great egalitarian society of the world. It's not uncommon to hear Prime Ministers say that. It's much rarer to hear them start to talk about there are students not getting the right sort of opportunities. We are not giving a fair go to students in our schools. That's the Australian Prime Minister saying that. And sociologists have been saying this for 30, 40, 50 years. And here's perhaps an opportunity to do something about it, and it is going to be interesting to see how this plays itself out over the coming months, especially in this election year. And what's your contribution to this debate? Where do you stand in regards to this? And how do you justify your stance, whatever that might be? What we're going to be doing then in this particular module, revising, consolidating, thinking back through ideas of late and second modernity, habitus, cultural capital. Social class is shadowing all of that. And then there'll be issues around gender, ability, disabilities, things like that. We're going to be evaluating reproductions versus modernist meritocratic arguments, as I've discussed, and I'm going to give you a few ideas about that in a moment. And the sociology of choice in second modernity. And that's something I want to talk about through the research that I've done. Schooling in Capitalist America, a book released in 1976. I still remember talking to a Canadian sociologist of education who said when this book came out, it hit him straight between the eyes. Somebody trained in standard structural functional readings of schooling that he had had at the time. When he got this particular critical appraisal of schooling, he said it changed his life, it changed the way he thought about his work and his research, it changed the way he taught in this particular arena. Part of the point that Bowles and Gintis make through this book, through the ideas of Althusser, a Marxist theorist, they make the point that schools are one of the most powerful ideological state apparatuses of modern capitalism. You want to understand how modern states are formed? Look at how they form education. They're going to tell us something about state formation. There are places where students are ideologically positioned to assume her or his role in the class structure. It's classic structural functional line, but of course the difference here is that it's a point of critique. Schools reproduce structural inequalities. They do not transform or transcend them. They may carry that promise, but the realities are that people who are born poor will not function, will not go through the school system as they should. They have got far less chance of getting to university, and the exceptions only prove the rule is part of what they're arguing. Then in 1977, the book Reproduction in Education, Society and Culture was translated into English by Pierre Bourdieu and Jean-Claude Passeron. And you've already been, I think, introduced to some of the ideas of Monsieur Bourdieu. And what they're making the point is that different classes are engaged in a struggle to impose the definition of the social world most in conformity with their interests. So Bourdieu's ideas are very, very much focused on ideas of struggle, which is a very common critical appraisal of society, that there are struggles, and of course what he's suggesting is it's a class struggle. But what he's doing a bit differently, what he and Passeron are doing here that's a bit different, is they're shifting the grounds of the debate away from the economic to the cultural domain. So they're saying that there are symbolic conflicts of everyday life and or struggle for legitimacy over symbolic violence. Symbolic violence, the power to impose interpretations of social reality. Who has the power? Well, Bourdieu and Passeron suggest very clearly that the ideas that are most likely to prevail here are those of elites in society. And these elites, in serving their own interests, the producers of knowledge and its interpretation, serve the interests of groups external to their field of production. So the elite views of the world prevail. What gets tested in schools, what gets examined in order for students to make the transition from school to university is the knowledge that is valued by elite groups. That's why we're reading Shakespeare, perhaps. That's arguably the case. The ways in which it's vital to be, say, involved with museum culture or to know the literary canons of the world become part of what is valued most, is part of what Bourdieu is arguing, and that's what paves the way for students to progress, and that gets naturalized, that gets turned into ability somehow, is part of what he's arguing here. So that what we're measuring is ability, not taste, not distinction, not cultural capital. He's saying that that's part of what's been hidden through the schooling system. By transforming social distinctions into educational distinction, schools reproduce and legitimate the class structure. They naturalize the outcomes of the education process. In 1979, a significant book gets released called Learning to Labour by Paul Willis. This is a study of working class kids in an industrial town that he called Hammertown, and this is Hammertown High that he did the research in, and the subtitle's significant: How Working Class Kids Get Working Class Jobs. This is a study from the bottom up. This is a study of the students in school, a particular group of students, those who are resisting schooling, in various ways, symbolically and quite physically, in lots of ways, but they reject the cultural values of school in favour of the shop floor, the factories that their dads are working in. So the cultural practice and values of their fathers is what they hold up as being of greatest virtue. Schooling is crap, schooling is rubbish, it does not serve us any purpose. How is that going to help us in the factory, which is where we're going? And so they reject school out of hand, they leave as soon as they can, and as Willis points out, this is where we can start to see how working class kids get working class jobs, how they are actually involved in reproducing their own class positioning. So it's not just imposed upon them, it also is something that they are actively engaging with themselves and valorizing for themselves and validating for themselves. And of course, putting different values, different cultural capital is at play here. And it's not necessarily about a lack of cultural capital, it's different. And I think that's an important point to bear in mind. Now, there are alternative conceptualizations. Crooks, in the Australia and New Zealand Journal of Sociology, which is now called the Journal of Sociology, focused on occupational returns to cultural participation in Australia. And in there he outlines very neatly, I think, a difference between modernisation theory, as he calls it, and reproduction theory. So for those of you who are able to get hold of that article, and it's not freely available online, I don't believe, you might be able to find it out there, but those of you able to get hold of this particular article, it's worth a read just for the introduction, if nothing else. Ascription, he points out, is the fixed social and family background attributes influencing socioeconomic attainment. Okay, so it's your background that determines where you get to in life, and that background, be it race, ethnicity, gender, and particularly socioeconomic status, social class, and its impacts upon where one gets to in life. So that's the argument by ascription. He also then makes a distinction with achieve criteria, where education and merit become the primary criteria for social selection, not one's cultural background. And what he's actually arguing in this paper is, and this is modernisation theory, suggests that achieve criteria drive occupational status attainment rather than ascribe criteria. Industrialisation accelerates social mobility, enhances social openness. So this is high modernity at work, breaking down the kinship complex, and taking away and he's saying that we see evidence of declining significance of family ties for careers, marriage, and other stratification outcomes. So it is much more on your merit. A meritocracy is part of what is being argued here, and that ultimately is what Crookes suggests is going on in Australian society. Your major task is to evaluate reproductionist versus a modernist or a meritocratic argument about the effects of formal education and their implications beyond the classroom. How do we work out, how do we explain some of the differences in our society, and keep bearing in mind some of the different bits of data coming through, including, of course, from the Prime Minister of the country in which we're located. In thinking about work in late modernity, I'm going to point you to this article later on about young app makers can't count on a job for life. Look at that subtitle. Brits force-fed the language of enterprise and no jobs for life are now putting into practice and getting precisely nowhere. Well, that's certainly telling you where the author of that article is coming from. Worth having a look though, because in terms of this is work in late modernity. I think that's part of what's being discussed here. And again, see what you make of it, see what evaluation you want to make from it. Let me remind you, from this week's readings and lectures, understanding the difference between reproductionist and modernisation approaches in education and work, understanding the ideas of habitus and its applications, grasping the implications of ascription and achievement to the educational debate, and further developing your understanding of practice and structuration theory. Good luck with it. I'll catch up with you a bit later on when I discuss some of these ideas a bit further.